Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to the Mana Fix. Today we're coming at you with another awesome deck tech, and this one is all about Planewalkers. And no, this is not an Atraxa deck. Instead, we're running Estrid the Masked. I've always wanted to build a Superfriends deck, but everybody and their mother's mother runs Atraxa. So I wanted to do something a little bit different, and Estrid happens to be a great alternative. In these colors, we're still able to run most of the best Planeswalkers, but we're also able to run an Enchantress package that acts as the value engine for the deck, and also has some interesting synergies with our Planeswalkers. Let's get into the meat of this deck to see what it's all about. Let's get started with the Enchantress part of our deck, and we'll start with Ramp. With the Ramp cards in this deck, we're mainly building off of Estrid's +2 ability. This untaps all enchanted permanents we control, which works incredibly well with cards like Wild Growth or Utopia Sprawl. These are 1-cost auras that enchant a land we control. With Wild Growth, when we tap the enchanted land, it's going to add an additional green mana. With Utopia Sprawl, we choose a color as it enters, and then the enchanted land adds an additional mana of the chosen color when it's tapped. These have great value on their own because they ramp you by 1 for just 1 mana, but again have that added benefit of untapping when we plus our commander. We're also running Fertile Ground and Wolfwillow Haven. Fertile Ground produces 1 mana of any color when the enchanted land is tapped, and Wolfwillow Haven gives us an additional green when the land is tapped. We also have some 3 CMC land enchantments. Weirding Wood is a bit different because it gives the enchanted land an additional mana ability. That ability allows the land to tap for 2 mana of any one color, so it fixes our mana and it ramps us. It also has an additional payoff of creating a clue when it enters, so we'll be able to draw a card off of that if we need to. Gift of Paradise is very similar. Again, the land gets the additional ability of tapping for 2 mana of any one color. This one also gains us 3 life when it enters the battlefield. Overgrowth is another great option. This one gives us an additional 2 green mana when the enchanted land is tapped. This card is ramping us by 2 for just 3 mana. That's value that's almost unheard of. Moving on though, we're even running 1 4-cost option in Dawn's Reflection. This is sort of our version of Explosive Vegetation or something like that. When the enchanted land is tapped for mana, it adds 2 additional mana in any combination of colors. Another form of ramp that works really well with these enchantments is any creature that can untap our lands. Arbor Elf and Voyaging Satyr both do that for us. If we're using one of these guys to untap one of our enchanted lands, then at a minimum they're producing 2 additional mana for us, which is really great value. Magus of the Candelabra is another creature that can do this for us. But this guy can untap multiple lands at once, so he's especially powerful if we have multiple enchanted lands out. Exploration and Dryad of the Elysian Grove are 2 enchantments that allow us to play an additional land on each of our turns. Dryad of the Elysian Grove will also help us fix our mana because it allows us to tap our lands for any color. To round out the ramp, we're running a couple of the best 2 CMC options that our format has to offer. Nature's Lore and 3 Visits both allow us to search our library for a forest card and put it into play untapped. Finally, we have one more card that could be considered ramp, and that's Mirari's Wake. Having this enchantment out means all of our lands are going to tap for 1 additional mana. This stacks with our land auras, so if we have a land out that's enchanted with Wild Growth, that land will tap for 3 total mana because of the 1 additional green from Wild Growth and the 1 additional mana from Mirari's Wake. This also gives creatures we control +1/+1. Getting this out will very often set us ahead of the competition. Continuing with this Enchantress theme, let's talk about what cards are going to help us with card advantage in the deck. When you think of an Enchantress deck, cards like Argothian Enchantress, Enchantress's Presence, or Eidolon of Blossoms often come to mind. Argothian Enchantress and Enchantress's Presence will draw us a card whenever we cast an enchantment spell. Eidolon of Blossoms is similar, but it's actually a little bit better in this deck. This draws us a card whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under our control, and we also draw a card when Eidolon of Blossoms itself enters the battlefield. This is a little bit better because not only will we draw a card after casting an enchantment, but we'll also draw a card if we use our commander's -1 ability. Moving on, we're also running Mystic Remora and Rhystic Study in this deck, 2 enchantments that draw us cards when our opponents play spells. Mystic Remora triggers for non-creature spells, but has a steeper cost to prevent the ability. Rhystic Study triggers for everything, but only requires our opponents to pay 1 mana to prevent the draw. Still, having to pay 1 additional mana for every spell you cast ends up being a pretty big drawback, and our opponents will at times be forced to allow us to draw the card. We're also running Sylvan Library, which allows us to draw up to 2 additional cards each turn, depending on how much life we're willing to pay. Land tax also provides card advantage, although we might not always think of it that way. At our upkeep, if an opponent controls more lands than we do, we can search our library for up to 3 basic lands, put them into our hand, and then shuffle our library. This is pretty much going to ensure that we have a land drop every turn, but it's also thinning out our deck so that we're more likely to draw into something we need instead of a basic land that we don't need. Moving on, let's talk about the removal options we have in this deck. Believe it or not, all of our removal spells are actually enchantments. First up, we have Imprisoned in the Moon and Song of the Dryads. Not only are these great in an enchantment deck, but these are just great removal spells in general. These auras turn the permanent they're enchanting into a land, making them almost useless. This can often be better than destroying the creature or other permanent because it can't be returned from the graveyard. Our opponents would have to have enchantment removal in hand to get their thing back. Oblivion Ring is another great option. This enchantment can exile any non-land permanent. Again, our opponents need enchantment removal to get that card back. Darksteel Mutation is an aura that can only be used to enchant a creature, but this one is cheaper at 2 mana. It turns the enchanted creature into a 0/1 with indestructible and no other abilities, again, rendering the targeted creature essentially useless. Probably the best option we have for targeted removal is Grasp of Fate. This card acts as an Oblivion Ring, but for each of our opponents. So in a 4-player game, this card is able to exile 3 total non-land permanents, which is amazing value. So we'll soon get into the Planeswalkers we're running, but first we need to talk about loyalty counters. Our primary game plan is to use the ultimate on one or more of our Planeswalkers. The easiest way to do this, of course, is with cards like Doubling Season or Vorinclex, Monstrous Raider. With Doubling Season in play, when we cast one of our walkers, it's going to enter with double the amount of loyalty counters than it would normally enter with. It also turns our +1 abilities into +2 abilities, +2 abilities into +4 abilities, +3 abilities into... yeah, okay, I think you get the point. The new Vorinclex has the same effect on our Planeswalkers, with the added benefit of being a 6/6 body with trample and haste, and reducing the number of counters that our opponents put on permanents. But we have other cards besides these two that'll help us get loyalty counters. Deep Glow Skate is another great one. When this creature enters the battlefield, it's going to double the number of loyalty counters on all of our Planeswalkers. So this can allow us to ult a Planeswalker or 2 in a pinch. Oath of Gideon is an enchantment that says each of our Planeswalkers enters the battlefield with an additional loyalty counter. It also creates 2 1/1 tokens when it enters, which is nice because those will act as blockers if someone decides to attack one of our Planeswalkers. With Evolution Sage, every time a land enters under our control, we get to proliferate, which means our commander and any other walkers we control are going to get an additional loyalty counter. Inexorable Tide is a great card to have with Planeswalkers out. Every time we cast a spell with this enchantment out, we're going to proliferate. This is going to make those loyalty counters add up real quick. And then there's Oath of Teferi. This helps our Planeswalkers out in a couple of ways. With its first ability, when it enters, we exile a permanent we control and then return it to the battlefield at the next end step. If we have a Planeswalker that has fewer loyalty counters on it than its base amount, we can use this ability to reset its loyalty counters. The second ability on this enchantment lets us use abilities of our Planeswalkers twice on our turn instead of just once. That ability alone makes this enchantment worth running because it's incredibly powerful. Now we do have one combo enabler, and that's the Chain Veil. This card is great in general because, like Oath of Teferi, activating this artifact allows us to use our Planeswalker abilities an additional time each turn. But what's even better about this is the fact that we can combo with it. Our primary way to combo with the Chain Veil is using our commander. First, we need to enchant the Chain Veil using Estrid's -1 ability. That's going to put an aura on it so that when we plus Estrid, the Chain Veil will untap. So now we activate the Chain Veil, allowing us to activate Estrid an additional time this turn. We'll tap our remaining enchanted lands to float the mana, and then activate Estrid's +2 to untap all enchanted permanents. Again, we're going to activate the Chain Veil and float the remaining mana, activate Estrid's plus ability, and then untap everything. This can give us infinite mana, but it also gives us infinite Planeswalker activations, meaning we can use Estrid's -7 ability as many times as we want, giving us free enchantments from our deck. Needless to say, the Chain Veil is one of the most powerful cards in this deck. Alright, now it's the moment I'm sure you've all been waiting for, the Planeswalkers. So we're running a total of 14 Planeswalkers in this deck, which to some may not seem like enough, but the trouble is that it's hard to find decent Planeswalkers for less than 4 mana, so they're expensive to cast and they're extremely vulnerable to combat damage. So running a whole bunch of them isn't always the best way to go. Mainly what we're trying to do is use the ultimate ability on just 1 or 2 of these Planeswalkers, which is usually enough to win the game. In the 3 mana slot, we have just 2 Planeswalkers. First, we have Narset, Parter of Veils. Although this Planeswalker doesn't have a game-winning ultimate ability, it does have an excellent static ability that negates our opponent's card draw. Also, the -2 ability on her is helpful, as it will allow us to draw into more enchantments or other non-creature spells. Then we have Oko, Thief of Crowns. I think most of us by now know how ridiculous this card is. It's a little bit less degenerate in a multiplayer format like Commander, but it's still extremely helpful to this strategy. The +1 creates a food token, which seems kind of lame until you read the second +1 ability, which allows us to turn an artifact or creature into a 3/3 elk with no other abilities. So we can use this to target one of our food tokens to make a nice little blocker, or we can target one of our opponent's creatures, including their commander, and turn it into a useless little elk. Pretty mean and also extremely helpful for such a cheap Planeswalker. The -5 can be used right away with a doubling season type effect, but even without that, just plussing Oko once will allow us to use it on the following turn. Being able to swap our stupid food token with something like an Oracle of Moldiah, Captain Sisay, or whatever other valuable creature our opponent controls is so nice. At 4 mana, our first walker is Garruk Wildspeaker. Garruk starts at 3 loyalty. We're primarily running him for the +1 ability. Being able to untap 2 lands in this deck is great, because if our lands are enchanted and they tap for more than 1 mana, then this +1 ability is going to net us a healthy amount of mana each turn. The -1 ability here puts a 3/3 beast token onto the battlefield, which won't be used much, but can be nice if we're in need of a chump blocker. The ultimate on Garruk will rarely be used since we aren't running too many creatures in this deck. But if for one reason or another we're able to steal someone's Avenger of Zendikar or something like that, which can happen, we'll talk about that later, this will help us to close out the game. Kiora, Master of the Depths, is another great choice at 4 mana. Again, the primary reason for running this card is its +1 ability. Imagine using this to untap a Magus of the Candelabra and a land enchanted with Dawn's Reflection. At a minimum in this case, Kiora's +1 is going to net us 5 mana. The ult on Kiora can be used right away if we have Doubling Season or Vorinclex out, and it's going to give us her emblem, 3 8/8s, and it's going to allow us to kill off 3 creatures with 8 toughness or less. Teferi, Master of Time, is another fun one. With Teferi, we can activate his abilities not only during our turn, but also during each of our opponent's turns, and we can do it at instant speed. We can use the +1 ability to loot, the -3 to get rid of a threatening creature, and if we get him to at least 10 loyalty, we essentially get a time stretch. Next up is Tamiyo, Field Researcher. Her +1 provides an interesting way to draw cards. We can target up to 2 creatures, and whenever those creatures deal combat damage before our next turn, we draw a card. If we do use this, we're going to use it most often to target an opponent's creatures. Our primary reason for including this card, though, is the ultimate. Again, this one is immediately available if we have Doubling Season or Vorinclex out. In using this, we get an emblem that is essentially omnipotence, and we also get to draw 3 cards, so this ultimate ability is phenomenal. Another great 4-mana walker is Jace, Architect of Thought. His +1 takes a little bit of heat off of our planeswalkers by reducing the power of attacking creatures until our next turn. His -2 is essentially a worse version of Fact or Fiction, but it's still handy if we're in need of some card draw. Again, though, this is another planeswalker whose ultimate ability can be used immediately if we can double his loyalty. This is typically one of those game-winning ultimates. For each player, including ourselves, we get to search their library for a non-land card and cast it for free. This is how we'd be able to steal someone's Avenger of Zendikar, like I mentioned earlier. But maybe they're running some other game-winning spell like Craterhoof Behemoth, or Expropriate, or Time Stretch. You get the point. Moving on to the 5-mana slot, we have Jace, Unraveler of Secrets. Like many versions of Jace, he has a form of card draw, he has a form of creature removal, and he has an incredible ultimate ability. This one says that the first spell our opponents cast each turn is countered, which is really stupid because it forces them to play a spell into it that they know is going to be countered before they cast a spell that they actually want to cast, which is obviously a massive setback for them. And then we have another Jace, and that's Jace, Memory Adept. This one again has card draw for its plus ability. The second ability is interesting. This is a 0 ability that forces a player to mill 10 cards. Remember that Chain Veil combo we were talking about earlier? If we have this Planeswalker out while that's going on, we'll be able to completely mill all of our opponents and have them lose on the spot with his -7 ability. That -7 is great too because it can either force our opponents to draw until they lose if they have fewer than 20 cards in their library, or we can just use it to target ourselves and draw 20 cards. Next up is Tamiyo the Moon Sage. Tamiyo's plus ability helps to keep a threatening creature at bay. Her -2 can draw us quite a few cards if we have an opponent whose strategy is turning creatures sideways. But that ult, which again is immediately available if combined with a doubling season effect, is absolutely amazing. If we activate that ability, we get an emblem that allows us to return to our hand any card that would go to our graveyard, which is massive card advantage. Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, is a really solid planeswalker all around. His +1 provides card advantage, his -3 is a fantastic piece of removal, and he has an almost game-winning ult, particularly if paired with massive card draw. We just have a couple 6-cost planeswalkers in Elspeth, Sun's Champion, and Teferi, Temporal Archmage. Elspeth creates 3 1/1 tokens with her +1 ability, which will most often be used as blockers. Her -3 destroys all creatures with power 4 or greater, so that's going to help us protect her and any other planeswalkers we have out. Her ultimate is another that can be used right away when combined with a doubling season effect, and if we have enough creatures out, can even be enough to knock an opponent out of the game. Teferi, Temporal Archmage, is one of the most powerful walkers in the format. This is another walker that can combo with the Chain Veil by using his -1 ability to untap the Veil in a few of our multi-mana lands. The +1 provides a little bit of card advantage and card selection, and his ultimate at -10 allows us to use our planeswalker abilities on our opponent's turns in addition to our own. The last walker on this list comes in at a whopping 8 mana, but it's totally worth it. Ugin, the Spirit Dragon, is an absolute beast. His +2 deals 3 damage to any target, so that can get rid of a creature or deal some extra damage to an opponent. His -X is what makes him great, however. When Ugin comes down and we use this ability, we can choose any number 7 or less, and Ugin will exile each colored permanent with converted mana cost less than or equal to the number we chose. This is very often able to eliminate most, if not all, threats on the board while putting out one of our own. Ugin has the ability to turn the tide immediately, which is what makes him so great. We can easily use his ult with Doubling Season or Vorinclex out, and afterwards, he'll still be at 4 loyalty. And this ult is typically game-ending as we're going to draw 7 cards and get up to 7 free permanents. Now with all these planeswalkers that are susceptible to combat damage, it's important to have ways to protect them. Much of that is going to be ways to prevent creatures from attacking us. Meek Stone is one way to do that. This is a 1-mana artifact that says creatures with power 3 or greater don't untap. In addition to stopping big creatures from swinging more than once, it can also throw a wrench into the plans of decks like Lathril that rely on tap abilities. Peacekeeper is another card that'll prevent combat damage to our walkers by just stopping creatures from attacking altogether. Sphere of Safety is another great way to do this in the form of an enchantment. It says that our opponents have to pay X mana for each creature they want to attack us or our planeswalkers with, where X is the number of enchantments we control. That can often be a very expensive combat step that most will be unwilling to pay. Counterspells are also going to be helpful in protecting our game plan. We're running Counterspell and Dovin's Veto as cheap and reliable options. I like Counterspell since it can counter any spell, and Dovin's Veto because it's uncounterable. Another great way to protect our planeswalkers is to just destroy all creatures. We aren't running too many creatures of our own, so wiping the board won't typically affect us much, and it's a way of preventing combat damage to our walkers. Obviously, we're running Cyclonic Rift because why wouldn't we? Wrath of God and Supreme Verdict are both excellent 4-mana board wipes. Supreme Verdict is even better as it can't be countered. And then we have 2 6-mana options in Terminus and Descend Upon the Sinful. Both of these have the ability to get around to Indestructible, so something like a Heroic Intervention won't be able to counter those cards. Real quick, let's cover the utility lands in the deck, and we're just running 2. The first is Karn's Bastion, which can tap for colorless mana, or we can pay 4 and tap it to proliferate. This is a great way to get additional loyalty counters on our planeswalkers. Hall of Heliod's Generosity is another colorless land that can tap for mana, or we can pay 2 mana and tap it to get an enchantment back from our graveyard and put it on top of our library. With this, if we have out an important enchantment like Doubling Season, for instance, and our opponents are able to destroy it, we can quickly get it back. So that's it. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss out on any new deck techs. Do you have any suggestions on cards I missed that you would include? Let me know about it in the comments. Make sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram at these handles. And as always, thanks for getting your fix with me today. Stay safe out there. Peace out, guys.